Hi, everyone. Hello? Hi. Excellent. We start on time because I am Swedish, but we're welcoming people to come in, of course, and I will start by introducing myself and this session. We are delighted to welcome you to the Spotlight event on addressing the risk faced by LGBTQI plus people and people with diverse SOGIESC. And my name is Maria Holtzberg. I am a Humanitarian Disaster Risk Reduction Advisor for UN Women's Regional Office for Asia and Pacific. So I want to welcome you all, and I also want to welcome those many people I'm expecting online, and we're hoping for some great engagement also from our online colleagues. So welcome to you. Before we start, we acknowledge the traditional owners, the Turrbal, Jagera, and Yugara people of the land which the conference will be held, and pay our respects to the elders, past and present. We also acknowledge Turrbal, Jagera, and Yugara people continuing culture and contribution to the life of the Brisbane region. In the spirit of reconciliation, we extend our acknowledgement to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia, and recognize their continuing connection to land, sea, waters, and community. We respect all elders past and present. So thank you. I will provide you with a brief outline of the this session now. Just want to also take this opportunity to thank Australia for holding this conference, but also for this particular spotlight. This is a historic first ever conversation at this level in this type of space. It's the first, but we are truly expecting this to not be the last. So whoever's hosting the next APM CDRR, we'll be there. I will start by contradicting myself, because I said this is the first, and yes, maybe it's a first in this space, but it's not the first conversation on this topic. And for our amazing panel, and for many of you in this room, this is not the first time that you're discussing these issues. It's also not the first conversation for those that have lived experience in disaster contexts across this region. Our engagement and our conversation related to this, one of the spaces started actually 2018, again with the thanks to the government of Australia's sponsorship. A conference was held focused on LGBTIQ people in disaster risk reduction and the humanitarian system. It brought together, we convened 200 practitioners from the humanitarian and disaster risk reduction sector, as well as with LGBTIQ community organizations across the region. It was steeped in intersectionality. It was a meeting of minds and challenging visions. It challenged thought processes, and for those of us who were lucky to be there, it was an amazing experience. Since then, many reports have been written, which you will all be able to find or have read. Maybe we need to do more, or we know we need to do more, and I'm hoping that when we meet again at the next spotlight, at the next APM CDR, we will actually be talking about the actual funding for these communities to be building resilience. So I will now also introduce you to our speakers, but just say that this session will look different. You've been in many sessions. I can see it. I can't really see you, but I can see that you've been in many sessions. You'll fondle your phone, etc. But this is actually a thinking space. It's a reflective space, and we will be doing some work. None of you will be put on the spot, but you will be doing some actual work. So I'm excited to share more later what that will look like. But first, I will introduce you to the humans who are here and will guide us all through this process today. So we first have Manisha Dakal, who is, namaste, Executive Director for the Blue Diamond Society in Nepal. She is a passionate advocate for LGR and LGBTIQ rights in Nepal. She's also one of the founders of the Asia Pacific Transgender Network and former co-chair of the ILGA Asia. She's received many awards and should continue to do so, also from the government of Nepal, including the 2022 National Award Jana Sewa Shri. Yes. We have our friend, Jay Nasilasa, who currently serves as the Disaster Risk Reduction Coordinator at the Fiji Disabled People's Federation and the Fiji Gender and Disability Focal Point for Shifting the Power Coalition. Jay is a disability trans feminist and lives in the grassroots communities in Fiji. This is a strong advocate for intersectionality and realizing the importance of practicing intersectional feminism in all community development work, and it's an absolute honor. Clap, please. And then to my right, we have Billy Hayworth, a research fellow and lecturer of the School of Geosciences at University of Sydney, with also a expertise which is uniquely positioned at the intersection of critical human geography and geographic information systems, as well as with a disaster studies lens. They've conducted DRR research on LGBTIQA+ vulnerability and conducted participatory mapping for Australian bushfire preparedness, environmental livelihood security in Asia Pacific, etc., etc. All of these people have long CVs. Finally, we have the core of this session and the core of a lot of the thought leader in this space, together with many others, of course. Emily Dwyer, she is the founder of EdgeEffect, a humanitarian organization that specializes in the inclusion of people with diverse sexual orientations, gender identities, and expressions and sex characteristics. Emily has led work in the humanitarian and development space since 2004. I will not go through what she did in all those years until now, but is the thought leader behind this event that we spoke about before, and a lot of the thinking that we have in this type of space. So it's a great opportunity to now hand over to Emily to do some speaking.
I'm slightly embarrassed. I will acknowledge my co-founder of EdgeEffect, Lana Wolf, and all of the many LGBTIQ people in Asia, Pacific and beyond who are on the same journey to claim space within humanitarian development and DRR systems. Many who front up every day in really difficult situations and whose lives and stories, none of this work, this session wouldn't be happening without that. My role here at the start is just to provide some basic signposts for the session before we get into the case study, and I'll try to do this without taking too much time. So what do we know? From the case studies that have been done of various disasters in the Asia and Pacific regions, there's sort of a three-stage model that most of the research and documentation fits into. So it's really important to focus firstly on what happens before disasters. So many LGBTIQ people experience discrimination in multiple aspects of their lives. This can include within their families, within their local communities. It might be occurring within their faith communities. It might be harassment, bullying that they experience in schools or in workplaces. It might happen when they're trying to access public services, for example, medical services. It could be happening in countries where aspects of their lives remain criminalised. Almost 70 countries in the world still criminalise some aspects of LGBTIQ lives, or countries in which law enforcement targets LGBTIQ people through other laws. All of this is happening before disasters. All of it is undermining, potentially, efforts by LGBTIQ people to build the kinds of lives that can withstand disasters, the kinds of lives through which they can rebuild after disasters. And of course, all of this is happening within the domain of planning and preparedness for disaster risk reduction. Then we get a disaster happening, and all of those experiences from before the disaster impact people's experiences during relief. So it might mean that they're blamed for causing the disaster as divine punishment for their sins. It might mean that they experience harassment or violence in shelters, that aid can't be accessed because they don't have ID cards. It might be that aid doesn't meet their particular needs. It might mean that they decide not to access the aid that's available because they fear bad things will happen if they do. And then we run into the recovery phase, where housing, livelihoods and other support may also not be available or easily available. And what happens is the marginalisation from before a disaster can be entrenched, so that the next time it happens, again, it just goes around and around. What we're trying to do is break that cycle. There is a growing body of evidence from just the Asia and Pacific regions since 2004. In all of these disasters, there's documentation of what's happened to LGBTIQ people along the lines of what we've talked about already. And the case study that you have draws upon aspects of these. It's sort of an amalgam, but everything that happens to the LGBTIQ people in the case study today is drawn in some way from one of these examples. I'll also mention that after Pride in the Humanitarian System, we did some research called The Only Way Is Up, which looked at the extent to which disaster risk reduction and other humanitarian and development organisations, but also LGBTIQ civil society organisations were placed to address some of these challenges. And what we found is that often there are insufficient funds to do the work, limited staff capacity amongst DRR organisations to work on LGBTIQ issues, but also limited capacity of LGBTIQ organisations to work on DRR issues. A lot of competing priorities, and LGBTIQ issues often fall at the low end of priorities for development and humanitarian actors, and also blockages from power holders, people who don't think that this should be a topic that's discussed at all. It's critical for CSOs to be part of the picture, but it's also critical for humanitarian and development, DRR organisations to be doing their fair share of the heavy lifting. For some of you, what we're talking about might be new. But for others of you who have already heard about some of this before, you might be thinking about, well, what do we do now? And there are some tools, one developed with funding from UN Women, one developed with funding from DFAT that EduFect has produced that can help your organisations work out what to do next. And finally, what we're doing here is, I guess, putting a spotlight both on what LGBTIQ people experience, but through the case study, we're asking you to think about what's going on in your organisations, what's going on in policy, training, hiring policies, all kinds of things that are happening in your organisations that might be impacting your organisational capability to work on these issues. Maria.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you. So that's setting the stage for what we're going to do today. We wanted to run this session in an interactive way and not just interactively bringing videos, etc., which is also great, of course. We wanted to have us all as a collective think. And as Emily mentioned, we have a case study that is on your desks. The way we want to run this session is looking at, we will read the case study. We will also have one of our colleagues here read it out loud, and we will interject with some lived experiences and some input from the panels. After, we're inviting you all, and this is where you're going to start looking for the door, but no, you are not. You're staying here, and we will do this. We will look at we will look at this case study and together talk about some questions. The questions are on the slide here behind me. It's focused on what kind of aspects of DRR, because you're all experts. So what kind of DRR policies or programs would be found in this case study? That's one of the questions. These are not hard questions. What could those aspects be changed to increase the inclusion of LGBTIQ plus people? Would be the other question. And the third one is, what changes might need to happen in your organization or with you to help make those changes? We will have a read through of this of the case study first, and then we will invite for the group work. Do not be worried. This is going to be excellent. I just also wanted to say that we're basing this also, we want this session to be reflective, we want it to be participatory, and we are basing it on the do no harm principles, and which is absolutely essential in this context. Do no harm means to avoid exposing people to additional risk through our action. Do no harm means taking a step back from an intervention to look at the broader context and mitigate potential and negative effects. So let's keep that in mind as we listen now to Billy read a story, which is based on reality.
Okay, so you can follow on the sheets in front of you as well. Wendy, Nana, Noon and Sami live together in a small room they rent in a large coastal town. Tropical storms pass through this region and they seem stronger than before. Wendy has always lived in the town. Nana, Sami and Noon moved from the smaller villages. They live together as though they are family. Wendy and Nana are lesbians in a relationship and looking after Nana's child. Nana is also deaf. She can only hear people's words in very quiet spaces. Nana can usually lip read to understand what people are saying. And Jay is going to say a bit more about that.
Yeah, on this particular case study, I think for us, it's pretty clear to understand that Nana is a person with disabilities, as she is a deaf. She's a deaf person. Also, linking into the experience that she may go through as a deaf woman, having a same-sex relationship, and also looking at bearing children as well. So for us, it's pretty important to see the different forms of or layers of existing experiences that binds with lived realities of discrimination that Nana had embodied, which really reflect on the identities that she have. It's really critical for us to also understand that sometimes it's always hard to wrap around our head on particular considerations on the term that a person can maybe identify him or her in the realities of his or her experiences, but then just very clearly understanding that different forms of discrimination don't only exist in a vacuum, but then different marginalized identities it's also overlap and amplify each other to create a unique experience of discrimination.
Okay, thanks. When Noon was born, she appeared to be a boy, but as she grew up, she realized that she is a girl, and as a result identifies as a trans woman. Her father once told her to climb a tree and come down only when she was ready to stop what he called that nonsense. She refused and he started to cut the tree down. She was beaten often by her father and she hasn't been home for a long time. Sami was bullied at school for being gay, both by other students and the teacher. He lived near Noon and they decided to leave their homes and go as far away as they could. They were just 14 at the time. Neither of them went back to school. Instead, Noon and Sami found a place to sleep and work at a beauty salon in the town. Wendy sometimes opens a food stall. Nana helps Wendy on occasion, but as people started to wear masks during COVID, she was unable to lip read and understand what people were saying. People would call Nana deaf and dumb. It is very hard for any of them to save money. There was a pandemic last year and people stopped going to the salon. Then the government made everyone stay home and no one was buying food from stalls. They had so little money and they could not pay rent in the larger home where they were staying before. Now they are living in a small 2-room apartment, a small building behind a main house and much closer to the water. It's not a good part of town, but the option was that or go back to their villages and families and risk bad treatment there. During the pandemic, there was some cash support from the government, but the local official responsible for making lists of needy people did not include Wendy, Nana, Noon and Sami on the lists. An international non-government organisation, or INGO, also had a cash scheme for vulnerable groups. When they did their needs assessment, they used existing secondary literature, which didn't mention LGBTIQ+ people, and so they were not included in the needs assessment or design. One of Noon's friends tried to get assistance, but the cash distribution was via mobile phone. This was a problem, because they didn't have a phone service. To register a SIM card, you have to show ID, but because Noon's friend is transgender, she can't get identity documents showing her as a woman. And Manisha's going to say a bit more here.
Thank you, Billy. I want to relate this case study with my own story and with my transgender friend's story in our region. You are saying me, my gender identity and expression, that doesn't correspond with my legal identity document, like in passport, in citizenship ID, in SIM card and bank account. And the discrimination of not having the proper legal gender recognition impact in our life. And still I have the male gender marker in my citizenship and the passport. And many of our community in our region do not have the citizenship ID because their family do not support to have it, and because of the lacking of the legal gender recognition, or if they have in their country legal gender recognition, then it requires the medical proof. And medical proof means, the sex reassignment surgery. It is beyond our capacity. And many actors, many stakeholders, government stakeholders, civil society stakeholders, when they talk about gender, it refers to women and girls, and most of the time male and female, and they forget to mention or include the gender diverse people and the transgender people and intersex people are also exist in this society. So these challenges of this case study and my own story and my transgender friend's story, they exclude us to be in the disaster risk reduction management plan and policy, and it hinders to be in the part of capacity development program or preparedness training program for any kind of disaster, possible disaster. And it also challenges for us to access the relief assistance, as this case study also mentioned that, the story, because of not having the citizenship ID and because of, having the wrong identity documents, it's very difficult for us to access those relief assistance from the government and from the other civil society. And the data collection and the assessment, the vulnerability assessment also exclude the transgender and gender diverse people. That is very important for the plan and policy of disaster risk reduction. Thank you.
Okay, and I'm just going to say a bit more about some of the aid distribution and food and payments during COVID. So one way that LGBTQI+ people are often overlooked in DRR and crisis response is through dominant normative assumptions about people's gender, their sexuality, or families. And so one example is heteronormativity, which assumes that people are heterosexual as the norm. And so during COVID-19, there were reports of LGBTQI+ people being excluded from some assistance programs based on normative assumptions that were embedded within pandemic responses. So for example, in the Philippines, where same-sex couples and non-traditional or chosen families reported being denied local government food aid due to allocations being based on rigid definitions of what a family is. And so being aware of and avoiding these kind of assumptions is an important step for more inclusive DRR. Okay, back to the story. There is an office of the National Disaster Management Office in the larger town, LGBTIQ+ people are not mentioned in the national disaster management legislation or plans. The staff there say they have no instructions or funds to do more. This town does have a community-based disaster committee. Wendy, Nana, Noon and Sami went to a meeting once, hoping to avoid problems from other people. Later that night, they saw a Facebook post. Someone had taken their photo and written a joke about them. 3 of the group are devout religious believers, but none of them attend religious services now. Nana and used to go to a church but stopped after the pastor gave a sermon about the sins of LGBTIQ+ people. Sami was warned to stay away from the mosque. A disaster vulnerability assessment was done recently. A census taker from an INGO came to the house. When Wendy, Nana, Noon and Sami opened the door, the worker seemed embarrassed to be talking with LGBTIQ+ people. They tried to help him fill out the form, but it got very frustrating. The form had places to count the number of people from different marginalised groups, but had no place for LGBTIQ+. The enumerator put 4 adults and 1 child in a box called Others. Wendy asked him, "What good is that to call us others? What will you achieve with that?" Emily?
Yeah, there's a huge gap.
Did you understand huge?
Massive, gigantic gap in data and evidence that DRR organisations have to design interventions. Including LGBTIQ people does take effort, certainly more effort than adding a box for others on a survey form, much more than adding an acronym like LGBTIQ to a long list of marginalised groups that supposedly need to be consulted. It does involve building organisational capacity. Now, data collection and community engagement can often be really hard. It may be trying to do it in a context where there is problems with criminalisation or with stigma. But it's going to seem a lot harder if your organisation has not gone through a process of reviewing all of its policies, if your organisation hasn't thought about that the experiences of lesbians and gay men and trans people and gender diverse people can all be different, if your organisation hasn't trained your staff, if you haven't adapted your tools or your protection policies, of course, it's going to seem dangerous, difficult. You might feel like you can't mitigate the risk. But if you do all of those things, if you build partnerships with LGBTIQ CSOs, then all kinds of other options will open up. And indeed, if we're going to say that we're leaving no one behind, if we're going to say that we're reaching the most vulnerable, if we are indeed taking a whole of community approach, this is not merely desirable or achievable, but essential.
Thank you. Edge Effect was also doing work in the town and heard the story from Wendy, Nana, Noon and Sami. They went to the INGO's sub-office and asked them why their work is not inclusive of LGBTIQ+ people. At first they said that they are worried about doing harm. They say the community does not need to accept LGBTIQ+ people, that they are worried the staff of their local partner organisations would be against it, or maybe the government would stop cooperating. None of the staff there have received training on LGBTIQ+ inclusion. One INGO staff member visiting from the country office said that perhaps they would do more, but to tell the truth, their donor has not told them that LGBTIQ+ is a priority. Later that year, their donor put out a policy on LGBTIQ+ inclusion. Now they are partway through doing Edge Effect's DFAT-funded reverse partner appraisal tool process, in which Edge Effect and a local LGBTIQ+ CSO assess the capacity of the INGO to work safely and effectively with LGBTIQ+ people. It was challenging for the INGO staff at first, having to answer questions about their policies, strategies, training, tools, safeguarding and more. But that's called accountability and providing human rights to all.
You can clap. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, Billy, for reading. We are now going to move into the activity. Just wanted to say that obviously, and this case study is based on real experiences, as Emily mentioned before, but we also did not, but we must acknowledge that this is also an extremely resilient community that has always been able to build resilient, build networks, understand themselves, how to build a collective, the solidarity. We know that from the experiences of Jay, Manisha, who've been through disasters and supported their community in that. And it is important that we acknowledge that. And the next session that we're having in the next APM-CDRR Spotlight will be focusing on celebrating those stories, just saying. But now we're going to move into the group work discussion. And we are inviting you all who are already seated, but those of you who are sitting by themselves or with very few people, you may want to move into one bigger group. Where we would like us to collectively think and discuss the 3 questions that you're seeing on the screen, and colleagues online, you have them on your slide, and we encourage you to respond to the questions in the chat, please. We will not be sitting here and judging you. We will be walking with you and having conversations with you. So the idea is that we will step off this space now. We will cut the mics in a minute, and we will be able to go and talk to you all of your take on this case study and your thoughts. Does that sound good?
Yes.
Yes, slightly more enthusiasm would be nice, just a smidge. Okay, so get going. You can introduce yourselves first, make some new friends, etc. And we can cut the mics, please. Thank you, everyone, for participating in this activity. How did you like it? Did you meet new friends? Good. So we are going to just have a bit of a summary conversation. We've been circulating. Our colleagues here have been sitting in on some of the tables, and we will go through the full panel to ask their reflections. And also, of course, I said you wouldn't be put on the spot, but if you do want to say something, you're very welcome too. So just raise your hand and do so. But we'll start by asking Billy, what was your takeaways from this exercise? What did you hear? What did you like?
What did I like? Yeah, I heard lots of good things. One I really liked was somebody said there needs to be safe spaces within organizations to be able to have conversations about LGBTIQ+ inclusion. And yeah, and I thought that was a really interesting point to start, because while there's lots of issues coming up and lots of really probably amazing ideas about solutions, if the organization or the culture there isn't ready to do something about those, then that's kind of a problem. So I thought that was a really interesting observation. And one idea for sort of building on that was perhaps partnering with existing LGBTIQ+ organizations, which might be formal training, but it also might just be conversations or kind of being exposed to different groups and different ideas. And I think for a lot of different issues within DRR, organizations do already partner with organizations outside of their own, so I think that is probably a nice way in. And if I kind of relate that to some of my own work during COVID, it was really clear to me that, in line with what Maria said about resilience and communities and groups caring for themselves and for each other, and if LGBTIQ+ experiences are not just about vulnerability, but are also about many other things like every other person, and that includes strength and capacity and coping mechanisms which are born often out of marginality. And from my experiences in the UK and Brazil during COVID, through some research, a lot of support was given by queer community groups to others. So if those are some groups that DRR organizations could be starting to talk to and partner with, then that might lead to some safer spaces and some more kind of useful conversations and directions for policy and practice change. That's it.
Good? Lovely. Jay, what was your reflection? What did you take away from your...
Yeah, from our group, we had a group of persons with disabilities that we had as a discussion on, and really they were just reflecting on the case studies and looking at the aspects of DRR. Really important on building on existing strength that's already been there in the different contexts of persons with disabilities and organization of persons with disabilities, and also linking it with the work of disaster risk reduction in inner communities. Also very important, unpacking the different layers that exist, knowing the challenges that persons that might have in times of disasters, and how best would support be provided to best suits, and also the importance of educating and awareness training to be provided to the local communities, communities of persons with disabilities who are also identified as diverse SOGIESC. There's not much areas of visibilities and empowerment covered in this area. Also, very briefly, identifying barriers and also ways of how we can work together to break down those barriers that very much exist in terms of disasters. And importantly, the more inclusivity in terms of DRR work, include persons of disabilities so that they're able to map out the best ideas and recommendations to support the work of disaster risk reduction in our communities.
Great. And then also the point of leveraging the existing networks, listening to the groups that are already operating and building on that. I think it was a very good point raised. Manisha, what did you hear?
I have gone through the second row, and most of the table, they are talking about the data. And data, the accessing the data and need assessment, mapping. And I'm interested in, the data safety and security. It's also protection is very much important because we are talking about the vulnerable communities. So not only the having the resource or assessment, but the protection and the data safety is very much important. Another, the discussion points in this table is the access of information is very much important because we are from different vulnerable community. We have the intersectionality within us, so accessing the information is very much important while we design any program, while we're sharing any information. It is important. We need to ensure that the people can access those information. And another, one table is talking about the mindset of the people is very much important along with the policy. So he's giving the example of Nepal. There is a policy of legal gender recognition in Nepal, but the people who are giving the legal identity, they require the medical, the certificate. So that table is talking about along with the policy reform, the mindset of the people is also very much important, and the financing and funding and within the organization, the supporting the LGBTI cause with the support of the funding and financing and training of the staff is also very much interesting topics that I have heard.
Data, colleagues, coupled with the do no harm principles, it's a real challenge, and it was interesting to hear that those were the reflections that you took away. Emily, what did you hear?
Yeah, so a big shout out to row 4 who all just dived in.
Winners.
And engaged.
Or no?
No.
Everyone's a winner?
Everyone's a winner.
Okay, sorry.
But I guess sort of one thing I took away was just the enthusiasm that you got into that, and just started to demonstrate that we can actually work on LGBTIQ issues. It doesn't have to be put to one side as something which is too hard or doesn't fit with other things that we do. It was people got into it, and I loved that. There was, on a couple of tables, there was discussion about, I guess, the interface between more formal parts of DRR, humanitarian development work, and the informal or less formal systems, partly acknowledging how difficult it can be in some countries, that it might be that, your organisations don't just immediately start by diving into service delivery, because that could potentially put people at harm. But there's things you might be able to do as organisations to prepare in that situation, or relationships you might be able to build in order to get ready. And some of that might be relationships with informal or less formal organisations. But that might also reflect the strengths of those organisations. And there was another table that was talking about, in a disaster, it's really hard to meet everyone's needs immediately all the time. And so sometimes those organisations might be ways to help meet some of those needs. But of course, you can't just rely upon community-based response all by itself. That while LGBTIQ people have strengths and we have networks, in disasters, those networks are also put under a lot of stress. And so there need to be ways to safely support those networks. Sometimes those networks are hidden for reasons. And so a bit of work needs to go into identifying what the safe interface is between formal and informal systems. What I'd love to see is more organisations using the tools that are now available to evaluate where you are. Because if you don't know where you are, it's hard to chart a path to where you want to be. And because so much of the conversation is sort of focused on partnerships, take a look at the partnership appraisal tool, which is a way to actually live sort of accountability and localisation, where you allow your organisation to be put under the spotlight and to be asked questions by LGBTIQ CSOs and who will help you work out what you need to do in different contexts. But the responsibility remains yours. You can't just rely upon us to do everything for you.
Marching orders. So we're quickly coming to the end of this session. I'm supposed to say things, but I also want to see if anyone wants to raise their hand and say something, how you feel. If you please feel free, do not feel put on the spot, but we want to create space also. You can always come and see us afterwards. We will stay, I'm assuming you want to see me, of course, outside, and we can have a further chat. Yes? Ooh, sorry, you need mics. This is a very professional space.
Nolina Bolivar from Diverse Voices in Action for Equality. We're a 11-year-old LGBTQI-led group in Fiji, and we're here because we work on all kinds of issues, including socioeconomic, ecological, and climate justice, and refuse to kind of be siloed into one part of our intersectional identity, and we work with many of the groups in this room. And one of the things I wanted to say was, we were talking in our group about the fact that there's a lot of people who maybe feel like they haven't ever done any formal or informal learning around sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, and sex characteristics. And I've been doing this since I was 16 years old, and I'm 54 years old now. And that knowledge changes over time. We learn more, we deal with the state and with society in different ways. And as we do that, I think we have to be honest with each other and offer services to each other. So for instance, we have a Fiji National University, and we've been providing 3-hour trainings to everyone from the board right through to everyone from academic and non-academic learning services. So that's one way that we're trying to kind of influence academic groups. But there are needs for kind of political leaders as well. So parliamentarians, people in technical agencies. We've done some training with UN Women, for instance, in the Fiji Multi-Country Office. But it's never enough. And we have other sets of work to do. So one of the things is kind of really building gender and sexuality knowledge and skills, and refusing to only do gender without doing sexual orientation, gender identity and expression and sex characteristics. Like saying, no matter what we're doing, if we're talking on economics, then you will also be able to speak with us about gender and sexuality. If you're speaking with us on DRR, we will be speaking with you about SOGIESC as well. So I think just demanding to always be in the room. Thank you.
Demand space. We only have space for, if it's literally 30 seconds.
Within the LGBT community, there is again a difference between how societies perceive gay men and lesbians.
Thank you.
I'm Farah Kabir, I'm from Action Aid Bangladesh, and I know there are still many countries where they have recognized transgender, third gender, but lesbians don't exist.
Yeah.
So we need to take that orientation. I just wanted to follow from there. So we have a lot of work to do in terms of awareness and sensitization. Yeah. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you very, very much. And it's an absolute truth that among when we talk about intersectionality, we really, really must look at the full spectrum. And for instance, make sure when you are reaching out to LGBT groups, ask, is there a lesbian network that we can work with? If you don't know them, find them. There's a lot of organizations. Not everyone represents everyone, and it shouldn't be looking like that.
And in fact, lesbians are women and girls, bisexual women are women and girls, trans women are women and girls. So if you're also doing women and girls focused programming or gender focused programming, there are all kinds of opportunities. You don't have to put us in a separate box and just do the work that way.
Okay, so we are going to close this session. We're 2 minutes over. You have to rush out to your next thing, but we will stay here if you want to continue the conversation a little bit. Just wanted to say thank you, profound thank you to all panelists. Can we please give them a clap? It's a long journey to get to this stage, and there's a lot of lived experiences that are sitting at this stage, and I want to honor you, and I want to honor you all in this room for showing up and for being part of this conversation and shift. So thank you. Go on in the world.